Hey all, Alex here at your home of the Music Deep Dive, and today it's time for another ranking video. Today we are ranking the top 15 albums from 1953. So pretty recently I did a video where I ranked the top 10 records, or my 10 favorite records anyways, from the years 1950 through 1952, so kind of the early part of the 1950s. And for 1953, I was really going into this expecting, yes, I'm going to probably find 10 records that I think are worth talking about in 1953. This is where we really start to see the LP format blossom a little bit more. Certainly albums become a little bit more of a central part of folks' recording output. People are starting to record music more explicitly for the album format. But even then, I wasn't necessarily expecting to find as many good records as I did. And I know that I probably haven't heard half of the quality stuff out there. So we are doing a top 15, and I am very excited for that. Of course, there are several things that are worth kind of contextualizing as far as the year 1953. The best-selling single of the year was That's Amore by Dean Martin. Martin, of course, at this time was still part of the comedy duo Martin and Lewis with Jerry Lewis. This duo will split up not too long after this, and Martin really starts to become a force of his own as a solo artist with Capitol Records. Other things that happened in the year 1953, Hank Williams passed away earlier in the year, and we start to see some of the first rock and roll records come out at around this time. Bill Haley's Crazy Man Crazy charts. Elvis Presley makes his first recordings with Sun Records. It'll be a couple years yet until he makes an appearance on this list, but he starts recording his first singles with Sam Phillips for Sun. And then also Frank Sinatra beginning to record at Capitol Records and beginning his renaissance, which will be a huge part of the emergence of the LP as a dominant format in the world of music. And as far as like major artists at this point, certainly Dean Martin is having a major kind of boost at this point. Eddie Fisher is a big name around this point. Frankie Lane is massive. Les Paul and Mary Ford are at kind of the peak of their powers. They released How High the Moon a few years prior. Just a lot of major kind of names in the vocal pop realm are really starting to shine. You're starting to see kind of this second wave of singers starting to emerge in the post kind of like Bing Crosby era, I suppose, with folks like Dean Martin, Tony Bennett starting to come on and around this point as well. So you're starting to see some major names there. And then again, the very birth of rock and roll is starting to work its way into the charts, and this will become really more of an explosion in the next couple of years or so. So a lot of major events happening in 1953, very important and transitional time in the history of popular music. So as I said, we have 15 records to talk about today. I do, however, want to highlight a few honorable mentions that I still think are good albums that are worth checking out. I have Miles Davis making his first appearance in any of these videos with Young Man with a Horn. I have Dean Martin, the aforementioned Dean Martin, with his debut record, Dean Martin Sings. I have the Chet Baker Quartet, Chet Baker making his first recordings as a band leader. In this case, it's the Chet Baker Quartet featuring Russ Freeman. Billie Holiday makes an appearance here in Evening with Billie Holiday. And then just missing this list, Miles Davis again with Miles Davis Volume 2. One of the stronger early bebop sessions from Miles, just couldn't quite make the grade for these purposes. But with that said, we have 15 albums to talk about, so let's get into it. Number 15, she started the list in the last video, and she'll start the list this time around as well. I have Ima Sumac with Inca Taki, released on Capitol Records. Definitely my favorite Ima Sumac record so far, possibly my favorite of her whole catalog. I would say, her first two records are really more leaning into kind of the exotica influences in a bit more of a traditionalist sense. A little bit perhaps more, I guess, a little bit more regal in some ways, a little bit more directly tied to the operatic side of things. In comparison, I think Inca Taki is a little bit darker than the previous records, more intimate. I think there's a bit more minimalist instrumentation here. In some cases, you do have the more maximalist stuff, but in other cases you have just Sumac singing with guitar, leaning into these kind of folkier traditions that make it seem a bit more connected with reality, I suppose. Like it feels a bit more like a more authentic representation of Peruvian folk music, perhaps, compared to the eccentricities that she was doing in the past. It's still weird. It's still a very unique record, and she's a very unique kind of figure. But I think this one serves her a little bit better, and I think it's a little bit more, again, perhaps it serves the Peruvian people a little bit better compared to some of her other stuff. So, very interesting album, quite a good album, I think. Worth checking out. In Kentucky, my number 15. Number 14, I have Lou Donaldson and Clifford Brown with New Faces, New Sounds, released on Blue Note. This is the Elmo Hope trio, the trio backing pianist Elmo Hope. Backing up in this case, accompanying Lou Donaldson, the great saxophonist, and then Clifford Brown, the great trumpet player. This is one of his earliest sessions, and we're going to be coming back to old Clifford quite a bit in these videos in particular. Shout out to Lou Donaldson, by the way, really great saxophonist who will also probably be making appearances in other videos as well. Just passed away just a few months ago, late last year. Rest in peace, lived a very long life, 98 years, nothing to be ashamed of at all. Great bop record, I think. Donaldson certainly shows up here, but Brown is the star of the show. I mean, already I think we are starting to see, his prodigious talent come into its own. It's going to get even more effective in a lot of ways when he starts doing other collaborations later on in his very short life. But he's the star of the show here. Love the riffing on tracks like Cookin' here. I think it's just really excellent, really brilliant playing. And I do have to shout out everyone else here. Like Elmo Hope is not a pianist that you hear much about these days, I don't think, but I think he's really sharp as well. I think he accompanies this group really effectively. And then, of course, you have the amazing Philly Joe Jones on the drums, who just adds a real sense of authority to everything. It's not one of my absolute favorite jazz records on the year by any means, but a really sharp session, really promising session from two real young guns who are just starting to kind of show their stuff. And we're going to be seeing more of them later on in these videos. So really solid starting point. New Faces, New Sounds, my number 14. Number 13, I have Oscar Peterson with Oscar Peterson Plays Duke Ellington, released on Mercury. I have mentioned Oscar Peterson a couple of times on this channel. I'm a big fan. Really like his stuff. And his trio work during like the early part of the 1950s is really, really good, really consistent across the board. There's really a couple of different records that I probably could have gone with here. He did a George Gershwin record that he put out around the same year, which I think is excellent as well. But this, to me, is one of the better just selections of material that he has to work with. I mean, obviously, I'm a sucker for Duke Ellington. Who isn't? But I think that the accompaniment that he has here, it's Peterson on the piano, Barney Kessel on the drums, Ray Brown on the bass, just works so effectively. Maybe some of this, too, is the fact that Ellington, of course, is a pianist. So, like, these are piano-based songs where there's a lot to... there's a lot of opportunity to kind of fill in the gaps here, which I really like. I really like his rendition of Sophisticated Lady. I think that's excellent. I really like the rendition of Prelude to a Kiss here. Certainly Take the A Train, I think, is nice. Even some of the upbeat stuff like Cottontail, I think, is really good. A really strong trio album, and a mark of just kind of the consistency of quality with Oscar Peterson. I do have a goal in mind to try to listen to his whole catalog. I doubt it's going to be a Discog dive video that's going to take a very long time to parse through, and I'm probably going to say a lot of the same things as compliments throughout a lot of it. But he will probably be making quite a few more appearances on this list, so you'll get used to hearing his name pretty quickly. Oscar Peterson Plays Duke Ellington is my number 13. Number 12, I have Stan Kenton with New Concepts of Artistry and Rhythm, released on Capitol. Another pretty forward-thinking jazz record from Stan Kenton, who, of course, was responsible for one of my favorites from the early 1950s, City of Glass. it is, this record is not, I don't think it sounds like City of Glass. I think they are two very different territories here. City of Glass is very much steeped in this kind of 20th century classical idea that really drives it. And I think the big band stuff is sort of window dressing. It's something that is very like, it's there, it's cooked into everything else, but it's not necessarily the main flavor. New Concepts of Artistry and Rhythm is a lot more, I think, traditionally big band here, just more like kind of progressive structures and stylings and things like that. So in that sense, I think it's not necessarily carving as much new ground, but still, relatively speaking, it's one of the more interesting and forward-thinking albums around this time. I really love the opening track, 23 degrees north, 82 degrees west. I think that's a stellar bit of playing. I also really like the invention for guitar and trumpet on here. Just really strong. Again, interesting structures. Very kind of, it's pointing big band music in a direction that it needed to go in. And even if I wouldn't necessarily connect this to like Charles Mingus and things like that super directly, Mingus also starts putting out his first records at around this time, by the way. There's definitely an overlap in the sense of like, this is where big band music needs to go in order to continue to stay relevant in any way, shape, or form with the rise of the East Coast bebop movements and that sort of thing. So, a really solid album. Really, really good. And if it's not my favorite Stan Kenton, I still think it's one of the stronger works that you're going to find from him. So, New Concepts of Artistry in Rhythm by number 12. Number 11, I have Django Reinhardt with The New Artistry of Django Reinhardt, released on Blue Star. The great jazz guitarist Django Reinhardt, most notable for the stuff that he was doing back in like the 30s and 40s with the Quintet du Club de France. Some of the most interesting kind of, not proto-bebop records necessarily, but some of the most interesting and forward-thinking jazz records from that era for sure. Just really fire playing. Reinhardt, absolutely great guitarist, and his story is really interesting. Tragically, this is the only record. So this is the only set of recordings that he made that was purposely made for a record. It's actually the last set of recordings that he made. He passed away pretty suddenly a couple months later. And in this record, I talked about saying, like, I don't know if I would call his early stuff like proto-bebop necessarily, but this is absolutely bebop music that he's recording here. And his trademark style, I think, just works so well inside of it. Really great kind of formative work, especially understanding like how electric guitar playing is immersed into the genre. I talked about Les Paul, that Les Paul is a big deal at around this time, and I think you can hear the overlap between what Reinhardt is doing with the guitar here and what Les Paul is doing on more kind of commercially driven recordings at around the same time in the pop world. Really excellent stuff. Tons of great recordings like Nuage's Night and Day. I really like September Song on here. Blues for Ike is pretty cool. It's again, it's not necessarily what you're going to get later on with like your Wes Montgomerys and your Grant Greens and stuff like that, but it is a preview as far as like how the electric guitar will emerge as a true featured instrument in the world of bop music. And it's just kind of an excellent listen on its own merits as far as I'm concerned. A deep shame that this is the last thing that he put out, but it is still a great session and a pretty effective way to go out for sure. The New Artistry of Django Reinhardt comes in at number 11. Number 10, I have Georges Brassens with Le Mauvaise Réputation. Don't know if I pronounced that entirely correctly, but I did my best. This debut record by Georges Brassens on Polydor, one of the great kind of French chansonniers, I suppose. One of the great like French singer-songwriters, if you will, from the early 1950s. This is his, again, proper first full-length record. This is such an interesting album. And I heard this once before, but I don't think I made a point of trying to translate the lyrics in real time. really important that you do that. Just kind of in I think, a general way. I think it's really important to understand what songs that are not in Anglophone languages or anything like that mean, just in general. But holy hell, it's rewarding here, because this is very subversive stuff. There's an element of satire with his performing, with his lyricism, that is so evident and so absurd, so macabre. I mean, it's all very simple, because it's just him being accompanied with like a guitar, essentially. But these songs drift into such macabre territory, such raunchy territory at points, and territory that might be described perhaps in today's words as quote unquote anti-PC, if you will. But in a way that is just, again, it's absurd, and at times when it's satirizing something, it's doing so with an eye towards like social change. A lot of great tracks on here. Again, the titular track, I think, is certainly a highlight. The Petit Cheval is excellent. I really like La Chasse au Papillon. But L'Aigreville is the most famous one. I think it's his most famous song just in general. An absurd idea for a song about a gorilla getting loose from a zoo and choosing to sodomize a priest, I think. And it's supposed to be kind of a commentary on religion in that sense. It's funny. It's kind of hilarious. It's really disturbing and disgusting. But it's, again, that sense of humor and that sense of like making like a larger point too, which is part of why it got, I think, banned from radio and that sort of thing. Just really amazing. Again, look into that song, listen to that one song if you haven't. And I think if you buy into what he's trying to do here, it's worth exploring this record, and it's worth exploring his other stuff. I'm not sure if this will be my favorite of his or not. I'm excited to explore more of his material over time. But La Mauvaise Réputation, debut record from Georges Brassens, it comes in at my number 10. Really interesting stuff, really good. Number 9, I have the self-titled record by the Jerry Mulligan Quartet, released on Pacific Jazz. Quartet lineup, as we talked about. Jerry Mulligan, really great saxophone player. He's on the baritone saxophone here, and I think does an excellent job. Just some great kind of riffing, some kick-ass just like sax licks on some of these tracks here. Tracks like Lullaby of the Leaves and Soft Shoe, for instance. Just the saxophone playing is amazing here, and certainly a highlight. You have to give a shout out to the rhythm section, of course, Bob Whitlock and the great Chico Hamilton on the drums. But certainly, even if I don't know if he's the highlight of these sessions per se, you have to shout out Chet Baker on the trumpet. This is one of his earliest sessions as well. Really good year, by the way, for trumpeters with the initials CB. I just kind of realized that. Chet Baker and Clifford Brown both. But yeah, such a standout already. It's really kind of bright. It's authoritative. It absolutely is happy to go toe-to-toe with Mulligan, someone who already at the time who'd been doing it for a little bit as a sideman. Baker comes in and is just, lights out right away. So his riffing on tracks like, Bernie's Tune and Walking Shoes and Freeway and stuff like that, just so excellent, so good. Really sharp quartet record, really sharp bop record. Yeah, there's not a whole lot more to say. I think they're both going to go on to do better things, certainly, but really great stuff for the year. Jerry Mulligan Quartet, number 9, self-titled. Check it out. Number 8, I have Tom Lehrer with Songs by Tom Lehrer, released on his own label, Lehrer Records. Self-released album in 1953. Very forward-thinking. Kind of, you can go back to the Georges Brassens record, and you can kind of make some overlapping statements of praise for that record and for this Tom Lehrer record, because both of them live in this same piece of like satire and things like that. Tom Lehrer, if you're not familiar, like super foundational member of the world of like satirical performers, if you will. A ton of satirists, musical and otherwise, have taken influence from him. And of course, his real musical career only really lasted for like 15-ish years or something like that. It was always kind of a hobby. His songs ended up becoming popular enough that he translated that into like live performances and stuff. And then he just kind of retired in the early 70s and hasn't done much of anything else for 50 years. And I'm so happy to report that he is still alive as of this recording, 96, going to be 97 in a few weeks, God willing. But yeah, this is really funny stuff. It's definitely, there's a certain sense of like collegiate humor from the 50s that if you are exposed to it long enough, you start to pick up on the traits of it, I suppose. It's very much kind of like, there's a lot of kind of political elements to it, a lot of like referential humor, very deadpan, I suppose. And Lehrer as like a singer kind of reminds me of like what something like They Might Be Giants will turn into later on. Very like unique, kind of almost over enunciated diction. That's very much, again, it's a parody of itself, and it works. It just works so well. I mean, I love the energy of tracks like The Old Dope Peddler and I Want to Go Back to Dixie, Lobachevsky. It's genuinely funny. It's satires that are well-meaning, but are also taking on like fairly tough subjects at points. And this will continue in his other recordings and things like that. I mean, his whole discography is very accessible. There's so few recordings actually out there that it's very easy to binge. And I think he's placed them all in the public domain at this point as well, so they're easy to find. But yeah, just a joy, foundational work in the world of musical satire, I think, certainly in the popular realm, and well worth listening to even today. Songs by Tom Lehrer, number 8, a lot of fun. Check it out. Number 7, I have Moondog with Moondog and His Friends, released on Epic. Moondog, man, what an interesting character he is. Most people are probably familiar with Moondog through his record that he put out in 1969. And that's a great album, and it will certainly get its due when we eventually one day get to 1969 in this list. But the fact is, like, Moondog was an active musician like 20 years prior to that. He had been, of course, if you're not familiar with the story, like Moondog, this like, became well known as this like street musician essentially in New York, who grew to essentially like his ideas and his like performances got the attention of like a bunch of like classical folks in the New York area, and essentially allowed him to network with like some of the biggest like classical musicians and performers in the country, if not the world at that point, because people were fascinated by what he was doing and what he was willing to do as a composer and as a kind of producer as well. And the thing you notice with this record, which is his first proper full length, if I'm not mistaken, is just how much he is willing to experiment with sound. There's things like tape loops in here. I love how he uses percussion. That's a kind of a common thread throughout a lot of his stuff, but here especially, it's such a minimalist work, and he does so many things with like producing percussive sounds. Like it almost at points seems artificial, this tones that he's trying to get out. It's almost like this very complex beat that someone would drum up in like a DAW today. Like if you tried to replicate it with like acoustic instruments, you'd have a bitch of a time. You'd probably be better off just trying to do it with like a stock MIDI instrument in your DAW of choice or what have you. But it's all fucking acoustic, man. It's brilliant what he's doing. And I love how he seems to, like, he's straddling the line between like just kind of pure folkier textures here and these more very avant-garde classical styles. And it's done in a way that's completely unpretentious. It's very like low fidelity, very quirky, very eccentric. Yeah, it's a lot of fun. It's, as all of these records really are, it's very brief. And he also put out some EPs at around this time as well, which are worth listening to. But I'm very enthusiastic about this record. I just think he's such an interesting and, again, singular figure in the history of music, popular and classical both. And, listen to your 69 record all you want, but I definitely think his 50s stuff is highly worth checking out if you have not yet. Moondog and His Friends, number 7. Really good stuff. Number 6, I have Nat King Cole with Nat King Cole Sings for Two in Love, released on Capitol Records. Great album. I already talked about this record in my Nat King Cole discography dive, so I won't necessarily add too much here that I didn't already talk about. This is the first full-length record he did with Nelson Riddle on the arrangements, and already, you're seeing that collaboration, which has been in effect for a year or so now, if not slightly longer than that. You're already seeing that collaboration flourish. And while Riddle, of course, over time will go on to make his name really with Sinatra more than anybody else, again, part of the significance of Sinatra signing with Capitol in 1953, there's still, you see where his arrangement ideas with what he was doing with Sinatra, you hear the beginnings of that here. A lot of the same strengths as far as, how these instruments just have this sweeping quality to them, and just how minimalist he can be as well. So many of those strengths are on display with this collection of material, and Cole is just so natural above it all on these tracks, Love Is Here to Stay, There Goes My Heart, the final 2 tracks, Almost Like Being in Love and Tenderly. Just, it's a really great fit. It's a really fantastic fit. And I think in that sense, this makes it one of the most successful vocal pop records of the year. Not my personal favorite, we'll get to that, but really just shows how strong the early 50s were for Nat King Cole as an artist, as he's starting to shift into his balladeer mode a little bit more. Truly great album. Excellent stuff. Nat King Cole Sings for Two in Love, number 6. Number 5, I have the J.J. Johnson Sextet with the record just entitled J.J. Johnson, released on Blue Note. This is fantastic. One of the best, just pure bop records from the year, possibly the best. J.J. Johnson, fantastic, bop trombone player. You don't necessarily get a lot of those, so, you take him where you can get him. And J.J. Johnson is excellent player, did a lot of great sideman work, and I love how he's kind of the featured artist here. Again, the headlining here is not just J.J. Johnson, although he is absolutely stellar. It's the fact that Clifford Brown jumps in. Second time we mentioned Clifford Brown in this video, but again, just showing what he is able to do, how dexterous and bright and how complex of a player he was already at this point. The fellow was 23, 22, 23 when this was recorded. It's amazing how much he is able to do, and how much fire and pizzazz he has in his playing. And again, the fact that Johnson on the trombone, a very bulky instrument, if you've ever watched someone try to play that, can go toe to toe with Brown, is really superb. So, and nothing against the rest of the ensemble. It's a really great ensemble with players like, Jimmy Heath, the Heath brothers, Jimmy Heath and Percy Heath, Kenny Clark on the drums, just great players here, but Johnson and Brown as the headliners are driving everybody here, for sure. And in that sense, it's really excellent. And I think you also are starting to hear the foreshadowing of bop music moving from the traditional structure to a harder edged sound, what we will eventually be calling hard bop and things like that. Not saying this is a hard bop record per se, but I think you are starting to see the seeds of that genre and the direction that bop music is moving in at this point. Excellent stuff. Great instrumental jazz record, one of the best of the year. J.J. Johnson, the J.J. Johnson Sextet, number 5. Brilliant stuff. Number 4, I have the self-titled record by Errol Garner, released on Columbia. Coincidentally, this also happens to be the oldest record in my collection, or the oldest LP in my collection. 70 plus years old at this point, if you can believe it. Errol Garner, I think, not a name that is commonly regarded maybe as one of the best pianists of his era. Certainly not one that the average person is probably going to know. But this record, which is a trio record overall, so fairly intimate, boy, this album makes a case for him. The piano playing is genuinely like virtuoso stuff. It's superb what he is doing. Garner has a very like chordal playing style, a very like chords focused style, which feels like a direct descendant from like ragtime music and that sort of thing. And that's evident throughout the whole album. And like the improvisational stuff he's doing on tracks, like the opening track, Caravan, is what comes to mind, because I think it's absolutely one of the best recordings of that song, full stop. Truly remarkable stuff. I mean, the fact that he is vamping on that song for quite a bit of time. I don't remember the exact track length. I want to say it's like 6-ish minutes or something like that, 6 to 7 minutes. He's just vamping on that for the whole fucking time, and it's just brilliant. So in that case, like, it starts with its strongest moment, but I mean, even the other tracks like No Greater Love, Lullaby of Birdland, Memories of You, Will You Still Be Mine? I mean, you see all sides of his playing, and certainly for me, this is not the first time I've heard this record, but I've come away from it thinking like, man, you talk about underrated players and talk about people who I think are worth championing as underrated in that sense. Yeah, Errol Garner is it. It's a phenomenal album. Could easily have been higher on this list, frankly. I just think that the three I have above it are extremely strong in their own ways. But yeah, I think if we're championing like a properly underrated record from 1953 that more people need to be actively checking out, and a player that people need to be giving flowers more than he's receiving them currently, it's Errol Garner on both counts. And that self-titled record, which again, I'm proud to have in my collection, it comes in at number 4. Number 3, I have Peggy Lee with Black Coffee with Peggy Lee, released on Decca. You want to talk about artists who were successful in the 1950s? Let's talk about Peggy Lee, man. Huge singer, one of the most commercially successful of that era, one of the most commercially successful female singers of all time. And, I think if we talk about the word crooning, and if we use the literal definition of someone who is crooning, someone who is like intimately singing in this particular style, yeah, she's possibly the greatest to ever do it. Certainly as far as like female artists go. What I love about this record, which is easily her most famous, is it's a smaller ensemble overall, but it has a big band ethos. It's a quartet that's backing her. And, you really get to feel like the intimacy of that setting at points, but boy, like when it launches into stuff, when it launches into these like upbeat, like blaring numbers, with some really great trumpet work on it from Pete Candoli on here, it's just amazing. And, I really love it when we're given these situations where small ensembles can create such massive sounds. It's really, really cool, and it's really fun. It's a really great, quote unquote, opening statement. She'd been putting out music for quite a while before this, but I think this is her first full length record. And again, it's stellar. I think Black Coffee itself is a phenomenal way to open the record. I've Got You Under My Skin, one of the great versions of that track, certainly. My Heart Belongs to Daddy is excellent. Love Me or Leave Me, the closing track, is phenomenal. I think, she as a singer has a very, sultry is probably an overused adjective, but it's the one I can think of. She has a very unique kind of rich voice, I guess, that certainly I think fits the image and fits the sound of the records just remarkably. Really great singer, but a singer who I also think has a really just naturally perfect voice for this type of music. So yeah, I mean, my personal favorite vocal jazz record from this year. I am curious to see how many other records of hers will appear on this list, because this is definitely her most famous work in general. But yeah, I mean, what an album. Black Coffee with Peggy Lee. Excellent stuff. My number 3. Number 2, I have the Thelonious Monk Trio with Thelonious, released on Prestige. This is the first release by Thelonious Monk after he moved from Blue Note Records to Prestige, and his Blue Note stuff is unbelievable. If you haven't checked it out, check out the compilations Genius of Modern Music Parts 1 and 2. Compilation of some of his best sides that he put out with Blue Note. I mean, it's genuinely like world-changing jazz music, some of the best jazz you will ever hear, certainly from that era, if not ever. And I love this album. I don't know that I would put this at the level of the best Blue Note material, but there's still just such a strong sense of inspiration here. Monk is such a singular pianist, and you will find this throughout his entire discography, whether you're talking about his early stuff or whether you're talking about the material he was putting out all the way through like the mid to late 60s. And certainly in this era, I don't know when you know, bop music and that sort of thing is still in a bit more of a formative stage. I don't think there is anyone else doing these types of scalar patterns, these types of chordal ideas in the same way that Monk is. Really great ensemble that he's playing with here that he gets to kind of jump on top of. You have Gary Mapp on the bass, and then the A side, you have Art Blakey on the drums, Max Roach on the drums on the B side. So just elite talent everywhere you go. And he's playing on such a smooth canvas overall that like you get to hear all facets of his playing, the beauty of it, but also the more discordant sides of it. That becomes evident on tracks like Baya. Monk's Dream is excellent, of course. These Foolish Things. Bemsha Swing is excellent. It's a remarkable recording, certainly for the era. Forward thinking, but forward thinking in a unique way. Because again, I feel like Monk, you always have to kind of caution any praise you give him by saying that like he's forward thinking, yes, but he's thinking forward in terms of what Monk will do, not necessarily what all of jazz will do, because he's always, I think, kind of in his own little world where he's never quite on the same page with everyone else, and that's kind of the magic of him. I am very curious, because I've heard a lot of Thelonious Monk records before this, and this was always at or near the top of my list, which I know is kind of unique, so I'm very curious to see what this will look like in the long term. But certainly just amazing recordings, some of the best of this era by anybody, and a very, very fitting number 2 for this list. Thelonious by the Thelonious Monk Trio, my number 2 for 1953. And at number 1, I have the Duke Ellington with Ellington Uptown, released on Columbia. Let the world know, let the word go forth, that I am a simp for Duke Ellington. I am a just hands on the ground, kneeling down, bowing in awe of the man and his abilities as a composer, as a musician, as a band leader, and everything in between. And it is baffling to me, as someone who doesn't know a ton about the man's life, it is baffling to me that there are people out here who consider this part of his career to be a weak point. Again, I mean, no one's going to argue, I think, the quality of his records front to back is still remarkably high. Both his singles, his songwriting, and then, of course, like the full-length records eventually. But I feel like this album alone is an argument against this being a weak period of any point. Especially when we talk about the track A Tone Parallel to Harlem, which opens the second side of this record. A monstrous composition, a monstrous piece, just so remarkable. It's just brilliant stuff. Again, it's a lot of the same strengths as Masterpieces by Ellington, which I talked about in the last video, but I think even more engaging, I think, here. A big part of that is Louis Bellson on the drums, who is just outstanding. He's featured especially on the opening track, Skin Deep, which just has a brilliant jazz drum solo. well known, of course, for helping to kind of originate the double bass pedal as a popular method of drum playing in jazz music. And you really hear that here, just such a solid pounding beat. And having that foundation with everything else, with the typical kind of dynamic swells and the just unique harmonies that you get from the Ellington ensemble in general. It's just, yeah, it's brilliant. And again, I think the amazing part is that Ellington, again, is revisiting these songs that he has done many times over the years and that he will continue to do many times. That's a huge part of his act as a composer and as an artist. But he always seems to do it with an extremely fresh eye. He's always interested in finding new lenses from which to interpret this material. And the fact that he is taking these songs and pushing these structures to the most unwieldy dimensions imaginable is a really brave choice that he always makes. And somehow it just kind of always seems to pay off for him as well. I think everything here is a highlight. I mean, the Mooch and Take the A Train, both classics that are extended to 6.5 and 8 minutes long, respectively. Again, the Harlem Suite, which is 14 minutes long, I cannot get enough of. Again, I think it's just a monstrous, monstrous piece that is absolutely brilliant. And consider also that this is a record that is pushing the LP to its brink at this point, really starting to play with the extended length of the long playing record and that sort of thing. So I think you also have that element of forward-thinking material, Ellington recording stuff to match what the distribution method will give him, I suppose. And I think that's really excellent. So yeah, and Ellington Uptown is a superb record. We're certainly going to get a lot more appearances by the Duke himself in these lists, but yeah, plenty of fantastic things to say. Elite record. My number one for 1953, Ellington Uptown. And with that, that is all for this ranking. I'm so curious to know if you've heard any records from 1953, what your favorite albums are. Are there anything, any records that I missed that you think I should have included or that I should revisit? Please let me know. I'm all ears. I'm happy to take recommendations. And I look forward to doing the video for 1954 in the not too distant future. So stay tuned for the 1954 video. With that said, I want to say thank you all so much for watching this. Please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. As always, more reviews are to come. Make sure to hit that bell for notifications and tell a friend as well. I'm watching you. You better do it. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you next time, right here at your home of the Music Deep Dive.